Yeah. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Classical Republican. Today we are honored to be with Dr. Phillip Pettit. For those of you who don't know him, he was born in Ireland. He is a civic Republican political philosopher. He has taught all over Europe, North America, and Australia. Today he divides his time between Princeton and Australia. He's written a number of books and papers, and his ideas have impacted classical Republicans all over the world, especially in Spain. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Really a pleasure, John. Thank you.
Okay, so let's start off very generally for those of you who aren't very familiar with Dr. Pettit. What are the principles of classical republicanism?
Well, there's one single idea that I think drives the whole program, and that's a particular conception of freedom. It's a conception of freedom that was clearly there in Republican Rome. It's a conception of freedom that appears at various points through European history. And it's definitely the conception of freedom that was there at the American founding. But it's very different from the way we think about freedom generally nowadays. So maybe I should give you a sense of what that different conception of freedom is. On the normal way of thinking about freedom nowadays, and this actually only came in really in the early 19th century, we think of somebody being free if they're not actually interfered with. So you're free in a choice if no one takes away one of the options, no one penalizes one of the options, no one misrepresents things to you, so you don't know what the options are. Otherwise, you're not interfered with and you're therefore free. But actually, the Romans would have thought that that was sort of crazy because they, for example, said, take a slave who has a very nice master, a gentle and perhaps a gullible master, where the slave can actually do almost anything they wish. So they're not interfered with at all. And in fact, in some Roman comedies, you get a slave like this explaining to the audience, more or less, look, I'm freer than any of you Romans because my master is, most of the time he's away. When he's here, he's very nice. And when he's not very nice, he's very gullible. So I can sort of get away with anything. And to the Romans, that was just a joke because you're not free if you're subject to a master. And distilling that a little bit, the idea is this, that we assume that there's a range of choices we can think of as the basic liberties or choices that are important to all of us in life, about what to think, what to say, who to associate with, what to wear, what church to go to, and what pastimes to take up, and indeed what occupation among those available to you to adopt. These are all sort of basic choices. Now, the idea in freedom in this Republican tradition is that in order to be free, it's not enough that people don't actually interfere with you. It's also important that they don't have a power of interference, more or less at their will, of the kind that the slave owners certainly had. But just to bring that up to date a little bit, I often use the example from Henrik Ibsen's famous play, A Doll's House, where you get Nora and married to young banker Torvald. Torvald, under Norwegian law, this is 1860, the play is set in, has total power over Nora. He can determine what she says, who she meets, what she wears, where she goes, whether she can go anywhere on her own or has to be with him. He's got total power. However, he totally dotes on Nora, and so he stays his hand, so to speak. He doesn't interfere at all. In fact, Nora, by the standards of the time, has almost carte blanche when it comes to exercising her basic liberties, those basic choices. She can act as she wishes. Now, the question is Nora free? Now, really interesting thing is I have tried that question on audiences, frankly, all over the world, from China to Ireland and North America, of course, and in between, and various kinds. And I've always had a unanimous call from an audience and say, no, Nora is not free. And then you ask why. She's not interfered with. She's freedom's non-interference. And the reason is that even though it's not even likely, let's suppose, that Torvald would interfere. The point is, she still depends on his will. She's free only if he allows her to act in these ways. She's able to exercise the basic liberties, but only with his permission. His will is ultimately in control, and she depends on that will. And in the classical Republican way of thinking, in order to be free, you've got to be someone who enjoys the basic liberties, the exercise of the basic liberties, and does so without anyone having a power of interfering with them in the exercise of those liberties. They might choose to give someone a power like we do to maybe our spouse and so on, but they're not forced to live under the power of another. And I think that's quite plausible. If you ask nowadays, in order to have freedom of speech, is it enough that the powers that be, maybe your employer, maybe whatever the powers in your parish or local town, allow you, oh, it's just John, let him say what he likes. We don't mind. Of course, we could shut him down any time. Well, of course, you wouldn't have freedom of speech if you only were able to say what you wanted, provided the powerful let you say what you want. You have to have an assurance. You have to have a power. And in the Roman terms, you have to avoid dominatio, which for them was the relationship between a subject and a master. And that relationship made you unfree, even if the master didn't interfere. And so Nora is subject to the dominatio of Torvald, and the person who can only say what they wish, provided the others allow them to do so, is subject to their dominatio in that particular choice. I just translate that as domination, and I say that freedom requires not just the absence of interference, but the absence of that power of others, the absence of domination by others. That's the core idea, which you find in the Romans, you find in the revival of Republican thought in Italy in the Middle Ages, in the great centers of northern Italy, like Florence and Venice and Siena. It's the notion you find in the Dutch Republic, or indeed in the English Republic of the 1640s, and it lasts in England even as the king is restored, because he's under the power of the people after the Restoration, certainly from 1688. And of course, it's the notion of freedom that the American founders had. So as someone, and if I can just finish with this sentence, but it's a wonderful remark by Joseph Priestley, who was a defender of the Americans. He was actually the English chemist, a very famous figure in his own right. He says, what is the great complaint that the Americans have? And he says, it's not that they actually tax us for 1 penny, or that we tax them for 1 penny. It's that we who tax them for 1 penny claim to have the power of taxing them for their last penny. And you probably know that history as well as I do of what happened in the 1760s, but that's really what inflames the Americans, the idea that the British Parliament, and they do think of it as the Parliament in the first place, is claiming a power or authority over them. And it may be quite gentle in dealing with them, but it's claiming the power of the master. And that means that the colonists are not free. And of course, they assert that with, you'd have to say, an extraordinary blindness to the position of actual chattel slaves in their midst, but that's another question. I took too long over that, but that's the core idea. And I think everything else flows from it, as I think I could explain.
Okay. Yes, thank you. That was an excellent answer. So if you were to explain how it's different from other political philosophies, definitely non-domination as the definition of freedom would be one. But do you want to take a moment to compare other ideologies that are prevalent today?
Well, between political philosophies, there are 2 kinds of difference. One is a conceptual difference, and the other is a policy difference. One is a principle or philosophical difference, the other policy-based difference. Now, at the philosophical level, what I've said already indicates how different it is from other approaches. So, for example, the sort of neoliberalism that would say the important thing is non-interference, and that means the state always interferes just by imposing laws. So we should minimize the state. And neoliberals will say, and markets never interfere because it's always by contract. So we should maximize markets. That differs from neo-republicanism or civic republicanism, as I understand it, both in the conceptual level, in thinking about freedom as non-interference, but also as a result in the policy level. Although we haven't gone to the policies, but we will, I know, that neo-republicanism would support. So that's one philosophy it differs from. Another is the sort of neoliberalism that doesn't, as we're focused on freedom as non-interference as an ideal, but focuses on what are often called natural rights. And that it says, look, there are rights that are just as were given to us by nature. And these require that no one coerces us without our permission. And of course, that, for example, in the hands of Robert Nozick, really strictly argues for not having a state at all, although Nozick softens that with an account of why, well, a minimal state might be okay. But it's obviously very different, that approach too. It's very different equally from the view that thinks, well, let me just stop at that. I'm going on too long. So those are two contrasts for sure. Neoliberalism, it also differs from neopopulism in the sense that neopopulists tend not to focus on the individual and the freedom of the individual at all, and sort of think it's okay provided we, the people, in some unitary sense, are in control of the person or the party that governs us. I mean, that actually would allow a lot of domination, I would say, in the lives of individuals. So that's also a contrast. And there's a contrast in all those cases, both at the conceptual or philosophical level, in terms of the guiding ideal, but also at the policy level. But I haven't talked about the policies that go with civic republicanism. Maybe you want to lead on in that direction.
Okay. For the rest of the interview, I do want to talk about equality and how equality can be brought about in a Republican fashion. I am working on some videos about James Harrington, and he was a classical Republican during the English Republic interregnum. And he was very influential. And I think a lot of people don't know that he was actually very influential in the founding of the United States of America and in the colonies. But what are your thoughts on James Harrington, and what are his contributions to, well, his most important contributions to Republicanism?
Well, do you mind if I back off a little bit from that
sure, yeah.
for a moment? If we're looking at the implications of freedom as non-domination, I'll come back to Harrington in a moment.
Sure.
Then there really, domestically rather than internationally, there are two aspects to that. One is that in order to be free, I as an individual, you as an individual, ought to be able to enjoy our basic liberties without being under the domination of other people, or the power of other people. Now that requires, if we're going to have equal freedom as non-domination, that requires a system of law and of supportive norms that ensures that each of us does have that space of our own, so to speak, a space where we are the boss. And I think that's actually a very old and very appealing ideal. But in the Republican way of thinking, it's very important that you can't have that sort of space of your own unless you've got law that's protecting you against the power of others. So in this approach, law is the source of freedom. It's not, so to speak, the enemy of freedom. On the notion of non-interference, law always interferes. So it's, on the face of it, bad for freedom. It may be better in the longer run than no law, but it's still, on the face of it, bad for freedom. Whereas if, so far, law need not dominate us. We'll come to that in a moment. But if law doesn't dominate us, then we depend on the protection of the law for enjoying our personal or private freedom. But the other aspect, of course, is that the law is always established by a state. And so there's a possibility that the party or the agency or the agencies behind the law that they themselves dominate all of us, because if they've got the power, so to speak, of changing the law, of discriminating against some people rather than others, or maybe reducing the freedoms of everybody, if they have that power over us, then we're subject to their will. And so we're not free in relation to them. Whereas the demands of personal freedom really are the demands of what you might call social justice, or justice in relation to other human beings, and of course, private bodies like corporations. This sort of freedom we need vis-a-vis the state, this non-domination we need. That requires all sorts of, well, I would say popular or democratic controls, ranging from forcing government to operate under checks and balances, forcing government to operate under rule of law, but also forcing government, of course, to operate on the basis of our choice, as in elections, of who's going to hold power. Now, back to Harrington. I'm sorry about that long. Harrington would have shared this view very much, that there was a personal and a public, as it were, aspect to freedom. One was horizontal, enjoying freedom vis-a-vis others, and the other was vertical, enjoying freedom vis-a-vis the rulers who form the law that protects us against others. Okay, so he thought that, first of all, law was deeply important, and he invented the phrase that's come down to us, that we must live under the empire of law, not under the empire of men. It means under the empire of the will of others. So the idea is that it's the law creates an empire within which we enjoy our freedom, because it protects us against others. But he also thought that it was really important that government did not, so to speak, dominate us from above. And the theme that he picked up as most important there, and it is important, but I think other things are probably important too, is that there are checks and balances. I mean, he makes a lot about the phrase used in the older Republican tradition was, it's important to have a mixed constitution. That means a constitution that distributes power to different bodies, like the legislature versus the judiciary, and forces them to sort of compete with one another, or forces two houses of the legislature to compete with one another. He thinks that that's essential if state power is not going to be assumed by one party or one individual and then used in a potentially dominating way against people. So I think of those as really two of his great contributions. But you want to talk about equality. And so maybe we can come back to Harrington if you want to raise something about that.
Sure. Okay, so when we're talking about like economic equality, something that always comes into maybe might pose a barrier is the issue of private property and how people regard private property. And if you read Mazzini, he says that there should be that private property is sacrosanct, and like you can't take it away. But then in the next paragraph, he talks about taking away property when people own it in an excessive amount, and when people are poor and don't have any property. He says that there is a case where you can redistribute property to some degree. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, if I may go back to Harrington for a moment, yes. I mean, he thought that there ought to be a redistribution of land, and that no one should be allowed to own too much land. Now, of course, that's really property, because at the time, land was the paradigm form of property, and was the way in which you made profit and so on, establish your wealth. He thought that it was important that at least there was a degree of equality, well, at least amongst those he thought of as citizens, and he wasn't absolutely clear, was everybody a citizen, representing the temper of his time, so to speak. But among those who were citizens, he thought it was important that no one controlled a lot of land. Now, the reason he thought that was important, at least one of the main reasons, was that he thought people who had such a sort of wealth in land and were greatly wealthier than others would inevitably be able to control government, and that the government would that would introduce vertical domination, so to speak, public domination by the government of those who weren't so wealthy, so to speak. Now, that really applies in the current time, where we suddenly have, partly for reasons no one could have predicted, the rise of the new technologies and so on, but also for other reasons, we suddenly have extraordinary extremes of inequality. Now, I think one of the main worries about inequality there is that the wealthy will, one way or another, control those in government, and that they will force government to introduce laws and policy that favor them and that do not favor others. And, I think that's a particular danger in the United States, given the dependence of parties and individuals in politics on being supported financially, and mainly on being supported by the very wealthy. And I think it's very striking that, for example, if you can take the GOP, let's call it, rather than the Republican Party, since I think they have no right to that name. They have long ago betrayed the tradition. And the GOP, the only policy preference it seems to act on is not often the policy preference it declares, but is actually reducing taxes on the extreme wealthy, as happened under Trump and so on. All of those policies have benefited the extremely wealthy, even though the party has campaigned as if it were really the party of, at least certain sectors of the less well off. That seems to me. So I think Harrington's lesson applies very much here. Now, one issue is, does inequality matter as where other than insofar as has an effect on government and on public domination? And I'm inclined to think, put it this way, that you could have differences in wealth. In theory, in practice, I think you probably can't. You could have differences in wealth that really didn't matter very much to other people. Some people owned a lot of yachts, or maybe forgetting about green issues with own private jets and so on. Well, it doesn't really bother me all that much that I'm not of that clique, if, so to speak, the power they have that enables them to buy the yachts and the private jets, etc., doesn't give them an edge over me, so to speak, in things that matter. Now, one way in which it would give them an edge, if it gave them an edge in controlling the government under which we all live, so the government policies were skewed towards them, that would be a form of public domination. Are there other ways in which you might give them an edge? Well, of course, yes, because in the face of such wealth, they can create conditions, so to speak, where really we depend on their largesse in great part. For example, if they, well, I suppose that involves government too, but if they manage to control all the land by the sea, beaches become unavailable to us. I mean, that is a sort of basic liberty, you might say, to be able to take your leisure. It's actually have access to water in rivers, lakes, and the sea that the rich don't control in that way, so that you can exercise that basic liberty of how you spend your leisure time without seeking their permission, without depending on their will. I think there's a nice test that I think is in the old tradition of whether, as it were, there's enough, of whether inequality is too much, economic inequality. And the test I use is this. I call it the eyeball test. And it goes like this, that I do enjoy freedom as non-domination of a personal kind in relation to other people, or in relation to my employers, or in relation to the corporations that operate in my environment, or whatever, insofar as I can look others in the eye without reason for fear or for deference. Well, in the old Republican image, say of the 17th century, or the American of the 18th century, I can walk tall. I don't have to toady to others. I don't have to fawn on others. I don't have to flatter them. I don't have to bend the knee. I don't have to tug the forelock if you have a forelock, I don't have. I don't have to go through these, so to speak, rituals of deference and keeping others sweet. If I've got enough in the way of economic wealth and the protections, economic resources, I should say, and the protections that the law provides and the culture provides for me, to be able to look others in the eye without reason for fear of deference, then I think we probably have sufficient equality. Now, how much inequality that test, so to speak, would tolerate, I think that's something that's going to vary from culture to culture, society to society, and indeed one period to another. So, for example, we live in a very different world now where a small number of corporations control a great deal of our communications with one another and control a great deal in our lives by having enormous information about us. So that makes for a big difference, as to whether that sort of inequality is allowed to exercise a form of domination of a private kind now over us. That would require laws to be introduced to stem, so to speak, the tide of AI, as you might call it, domination.
Okay. So you just think that that great inequality can be legislated out through particular laws that either limit or cap, as Harrington did it, or maybe redistribute the excessive wealth.
I guess I've got to say yes to that. Going back to the issue of private property, I think that it's almost inevitable that there be a property system of some kind, and I think even for reasons that Aristotle gave us, that makes good sense. That we do tend to look after that bit of land or that house or that car, for that matter, or whatever that we own, and in general. You might argue that there's good reason for people to have a degree of holdings over which they have protected control. They own them, and it's a basic liberty to use your property as you wish. But what I'm deeply against is the idea that there are natural rights of property, that, so to speak, it's written in stone as to what these rights of property are. I mean, the law is forever creating rights of property. So in some regimes, you own land, you also own the resources under the land. In other regimes, you don't. Different as where rights of property are established in law. So now, I buy a lot of my books on Kindle, through Amazon or whatever. And, well, I can use these books. I got that right of ownership of property, but I can't hand them on to, say, my children. I can't bequeath them to my children. And so the rights of ownership have varied greatly there. Rights of ownership are always defined in law. Now, I would say in the civic republic, rights of ownership should be always defined and defended, and in such a way as to at least raise the chance of the eyeball test being satisfied. In other words, not allowing such rights and not allowing such holdings, the size of such holdings, that would introduce either private domination or public domination. Probably the main thing in the private property area is that we have now, with given that inheritance taxes have all but effectively disappeared in the United States, for example, having been labeled as death taxes, which, is really a bit of rhetoric used to get rid of them. But we know that it's through inheritance that most wealth is built up and perpetuated. And you now have a capacity in American law, for example, for the very wealthy to actually try to provide for not just their children, but the grandchildren, not just their grandchildren, but those in their continuing, so to speak, lineage. Now, I find that really extraordinary and objectionable. And I find it objectionable on Republican lines because that allows an accretion of old money, so to speak, that is bound to have a massive effect on government and the state and on those in authority, but is also bound to have a massive effect on, well, for example, take universities, the issue of legacy rights of entry. I mean, I teach in Princeton University, where indeed, although we really, on the faculty, have very little access to how admission is determined, but in that university, as in many, many very wealthy universities, private universities like that, legacy rights are really rights of wealth, and that does create an imbalance in competition for entry to the university. I must say the universities, like my own university, has done very well in having financed blind admission so that you can get admitted and then say, look, I haven't a cent to my family's name, in which case the university will provide you with a free entry if you've actually qualified in their admissions competition. So they do things to balance, but still, legacy rights are a good example, although in a way a slightly trivial example. Even more important is if schooling is such that by having great wealth, you can give your children, a level of education that is way superior to that available in the public school system, then that immediately creates advantage, which again gets magnified into or geared into, morphs into financial advantage and then into all sorts of other advantages, creating a world where it's no longer the case that each can look any other in the eye without reason for fear of deference. I mean, so, I think that the answer to your question is that the classical Republican, as you call it, or the civic Republican tradition, as I tend to call it, it is very much on the side of you've got to watch inequality. And you've certainly, above all else, of course, you've got to guard against poverty, because people who are genuinely poor are not going to be able, won't have the resources to exercise their basic liberties. So there has to be economic infrastructure that ensures against poverty of that kind, poverty that would deny people the right to enjoy, the eyeball test.
Okay. Well, that was great. I believe we're out of time. But that was a great interview. I think everything you said was excellent. But before we go, is there anything you want to talk about? Do you have any new books or papers coming out or new projects?
Well, I do. I have published a book that's just appeared, actually.
Oh.
I should have advertising with me. I don't actually have a copy with me. As you know, I'm in London and away from my books for, initially medical reasons, but I'm fine now, happily. But yes, I've just published a book called The State. Full stop. And I mean, I may perhaps talk about that a little bit because there's a companion volume which is promised by the publisher, and I suppose by me as the author, which will be called From State to Republic. The publisher actually was interested in calling it The Republic simply, after, but actually we decided that title was definitely taken,
Yes.
So in The State, what I do is this. I think it's important to recognize that the state isn't something you can invent, so to speak, from scratch. We always start in the middle of things, in medias res. And at this point in history, we exist in a world which is state-bound. And I think it's worth asking about, well, what are the features of states that are almost inescapable, and then to ask, well, if we start from, okay, we have to have something like this, the state that I've described, and that book focuses on the as it were, aspects of the state that make it qua state function well, and that, we could look for independently of any theory of justice, because that's what the state is ideally. And then we ask the question, well, now, if we endorse a notion of civic republican justice, social justice between individuals, personal freedom, and democratic justice,